Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk. This week I talked to Natalie Belsky, a history professor at the University of Minnesota-Duluth, who specializes in migration, minority politics in the USSR, Soviet citizenship, and Eastern European Jewish history. We talk about her family's history in the former Soviet Union and how that history can inform us about what's happening now in Russia and Ukraine on this week's Who the Folk podcast. Natalie Belsky, welcome to the Who the Folk podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is a pleasure to talk to you. So you are an assistant professor of history at the University of Minnesota-Duluth within the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. One of the reasons I wanted to talk to you this week is because your sort of background, your schooling, you received a doctorate in Russian history, and currently you're focusing on internal population displacement in the Soviet Union during World War II. You had written a piece for the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies blog that we ran. Alejandro was nice enough to let us use it. You were kind enough to let us use it as well. Ran a couple of weeks ago. And it really, your background really does feel to me like can teach us important lessons about what's going on right now in Ukraine and Russia's invasion of it. So I guess for starters, how is this an area that you became interested in originally?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I mean, obviously, it has to do to a great extent with my background. I was born in Moscow, and my parents and I immigrated to the United States when I was 8. So I am an immigrant I lived most of my life in this country, but I grew up in attending school in the United States, obviously, but at the same time imbued in the culture and language and background of my family, talking with my parents, talking with my grandparents, what I learned from them and the kind of the questions that I had about the place where I've come from, the Russian history, Jewish history, Russian Jewish culture. It was something that I wanted to learn more about, and I've always been fascinated with history. So it's sort of a combination of my interest in general in history. It was always my favorite subject in school, and my background and wanting to learn more and about the place where I came from and about the history of that place.
So you'd also, in your sort of academic, your sort of recent academic past, you were a fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Mandel Center. How did your work there sort of tie into that background of Soviet displacement and your interest in that Russian history?
Certainly. So my work really crosses both. My focus is in Russian history, but specifically in Jewish history as well. So I do, and I have an interest in Soviet Jewish history specifically. So I've worked, or I've done research at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. I was fortunate enough to have a fellowship there and participate in some conferences there, and as well as at the Yad Vashem Center for Holocaust Studies. So my work speaks to several areas of scholarship, as is the case for many people. But my research looks at the experience. My current research project, I should say, looks at the experience of evacuees or internally displaced people in the Soviet Union during the Second World War. So these are people who were living in Ukraine, Belarus, Western Russia, civilians who fled or were evacuated by the Soviet state to the unoccupied areas of the Soviet Union, like Central Asia, Siberia, and the Urals during the Second World War, and spent most of the war years in those areas, while much of the western parts of the Soviet Union were occupied by the Nazis. And I look at the experience of evacuees in general, but I have a particular interest in the experience of Soviet Jews who were in that situation. And in fact, there were quite a bit well, there were thousands of Polish Jews who were also in a similar situation, were refugees in the Soviet Union during the war. And of course, for Jews, that experience was particularly important because the vast majority of people who were not evacuated or who didn't flee were murdered during the Holocaust. So it's kind of the group of survivors, Jewish survivors in the Soviet Union, were either people who were evacuated or people who served in the Red Army and survived that experience. So for Jews, the evacuation experience was particularly significant in terms of their likelihood of surviving the war. Personally, I have three Jewish grandparents. My paternal grandfather is Ukrainian. Three of my grandparents who are Jewish were evacuated during the war. So my maternal grandfather was evacuated from Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. Mm-hmm. My paternal grandmother was evacuated from Kiev, and my maternal grandmother was evacuated from Moscow. And hearing their stories, particularly the stories of my maternal grandfather, who came from Leningrad, from this big city, who was this, very typical Jewish boy from this big city who, wanted to learn how to play the violin and ended up spending the war years in like a Russian village and became a horse caretaker in a Russian village. So his stories were super fascinating. And hearing about their experience, I really wanted to learn more about this history because I found it really fascinating and unexpected and something that most people didn't really know much about.
No, I do feel like, hearing you talk about it, there things that I sort of know at like a very high level, but there's a lot of detail in there that I think gets lost on people probably. Mm-hmm. And I think it's sort of it's fascinating that you've chosen to take this deep dive because I know growing up as a child of the 80s, I know we heard a lot about Soviet Jewry and the push to for people to be able to practice their Judaism freely and that they do it in secret. And, as part of the generation of kids who were twinned with a Russian or Soviet child about the same age mm-hmm. who was going through a, B'nai Mitzvah in secret. Mm-hmm. And so that was a sort of big part of, my experience growing up as a, day school child was hearing sort of the more modern stories of what Soviet Judaism looks like, but the area of your study and what your grandparents had experienced is obviously incredibly harrowing and not, surviving the Nazis, but it's not like your other choices were particularly good ones, right? Being shipped out to Siberia or joining the Red Army, it's not like you're flush with good options there.
Right. And if I may, particularly, and this is not a uncommon story. My family background is very similar to that of thousands of other, sure. millions of other Soviet Jewish families. But my paternal grandmother, my dad's mom, in particular, her family was from Kiev and they returned to Kiev. In fact, my father was born in Kiev, and her mother was a member of a large Jewish family. Her mother's older brother was a prominent orthodontist in Kiev, and when the war broke out, and this brother had been educated in Germany actually, and when the war broke out, he kind of was the leader of the family at that time. And he kind of said, we're not going anywhere. The Germans are better than the Soviets. And, don't worry, I'll take care of the family. They'll definitely need, they'll need a dentist when they come, if they come here. So he spoke German, Jews who spoke Yiddish Yiddish is pretty close enough to German that they could communicate with Germans. Mm-hmm. So that he told the family to stay in Kiev and that everything would be fine. And thanks to the fact that my grandmother's father, so her mother was part of this big family, and her brother said to stay put. My grandmother's father was a member of the Communist Party, and he worked for the Telegraph, and he disagreed. He believed that if the Soviets said to evacuate, then he should evacuate. So his political opinion was different, and thanks to his employment and the fact that he disagreed, that he believed in that he didn't want to live under the Nazis, or he agreed with the policies of the Soviet government, he evacuated his family, and that was the reason my grandmother survived when 12 or 13 members of her mother's family perished in Babi Yar. So that was those kinds of discussions that took place in my grandmother's family were actually, now that I've read a lot of the primary sources, that was a common debate that took place in families. I mean, as you said, like none of the options were particularly attractive, and it wasn't like people had access to reliable information.
Sure.
Right? They couldn't open like Twitter and see what people in Krakow were tweeting.
Well, listen, the fact that you referred to Twitter as a reliable source of information, that may be a bit far flung, but I get your point, though, certainly.
Well, I mean, it wasn't, their media was filtered, Soviet media obviously was not was often not reliable.
Well, because it's all filtered through the lens of the state at that point, right?
Exactly. And as much as, Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, as much as social media is not, has a lot of problems of its own, it does a lot of problems. It does give us an opportunity to connect with people directly, which, people at the time didn't have, really.
Sure. So how much was this family history talked about? Like, how much did you learn from your grandparents and your parents who were there and lived that piece of it versus sort of the research you did for your academic practice after the fact? Just because I know in a lot of, if you talk to particularly children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, they tend to not necessarily have learned things right away from like their grandparents or parents that went through it. It took much longer for them to want to open up about something like that.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the difficulties in getting these stories out, and one of the reasons people didn't talk about these stories, was not necessarily kind of, well, shame, certainly not shame, perhaps trauma, but there was also the sense of, well, we got out, and that's not the interesting story, or that's the important story is the story of the Holocaust, and we were not, we were somewhere else, we were in Siberia, or we were in Uzbekistan, and that's not the story that you want to hear. So there is this sense among those who were displaced, who this feeling that their story is not the important story. And people want to hear the Auschwitz story or the ghetto story. And my family, I was very fortunate to be very close to my grandparents, and they didn't talk a lot about what happened, but they certainly, when I asked, talk about it freely, and then I was fortunate enough to interview them about their wartime experience, but particularly my grandfather's story of this coming from Leningrad and ending up in this village was sort of like a family tale, in part, and of course, later when I actually interviewed him about it, I learned about the not so pleasant parts of it, like, not being able to get food or getting lice and that kind of thing. But the kind of the family friendly version was about how he, was in this village. He learned how to be a horse caretaker, which again was, not something that would have happened had he continued living in Leningrad. And that, one night he was watching the cattle, and he fell asleep. The cow ended up stealing his boots, and this was like a big, and then he saw the cow wandering around with these boots, and he was able to get his boots back. So there were these sort of funny tales of his misadventures or his adventures while living in this village. And then he would also proudly say that later on he was able to impress some ladies with his ability to ride horseback, which again, like if you look at him, you don't think, oh yes, this man definitely knows how to ride how to ride a horse. Like he's extremely, urbane, loved to go listen to classical music, thick glasses. This was not like a,
This is not an outdoorsman.
This was like very much not an outdoorsman at all. So when he would when I guess on a few instances he was able to show off these abilities, this was like, a feather in his cap. Like, oh wow, Arnold knows how to ride horses. That's interesting and different. So he this was sort of because his experience was particularly, somewhat dramatic and interesting. There were family tales that would go around, but of course, when I talked to him more, I learned about kind of the less entertaining and more realistic, or more depressing aspects of his experience, including, the fact that the train that he was on was bombed.
Oh.
So he lost a friend in the process of evacuation, and he kind of, it was a very harrowing experience.
That's wild. So fortunate to be able to have just, survived that one incident, let alone all of the other things that could have, gone wrong along the way.
Yeah, no, exactly. And actually what happened was the Soviets, as many people know, were sort of prepared, but also very unprepared for the war. So Stalin had this notion that the war would break out, but it would break out on his terms. And a lot of the decisions that were made in the immediate aftermath of the invasion were really, problematic and wrong. So one of the things that happened was that they assumed that that when they needed to evacuate the cities, it would be like in London or in England, where they sent people to the countryside because they realized that the cities would be bombed. Right. Therefore, the countryside was safer. And initially, when they started to evacuate children out of Leningrad, which my grandfather fell under that category, they sent them just basically out of the city into the countryside. And they sent them to the southwest. So they basically sent them in the direction of the invading army.
That doesn't make a lot of sense.
No, the idea was, we have to get them out of the city because the city is being bombed.
Sure. No, I get that part of it. But like in terms of sound strategy, sending them towards the invading army doesn't seem the right path. Right.
Yeah, the idea was that, like, well, they're not going to make it this far. And of course they did. Yes. So that they were sent to Southwest. The trains were being bombed. They recognized that, like, it was recognized sort of as this was happening that this was the wrong decision, and then they had to be sort of very quickly ferried or brought over and sent back to Leningrad, and then sent in the other direction. So it was, again, very, very harrowing experience. And I think in part, I learned from family tales. I learned the most about my grandfather's experience because it was so. This could be a film, right? It was so dramatic. And my grandfather was particularly. He was a storyteller. He was really good at relating and talking about what happened, and relating his stories and his life experience. Luckily, before he passed, me and other members of my family were able to convince him to write his memoirs. So he wrote about his experience. So I'm very, very grateful that we have that. And still, even though, he, as I said, writing, he enjoyed the process of writing. He still thought, well, like, who cares about what happened to me? Like, this is not an important story. Like, his position was like, well, I had an ordinary life. This was, why would anyone care? And we just kind of convinced him. We're like, no, we care. And other people would care too. So please write this.
Yeah, it seems anything but ordinary.
Right.
So there's lots of things that you mentioned in there that seem very apropos for what's going on right now. What kind of, as somebody who's studied the history, are there any particular lessons or, things that you know from the past that are applicable to what's going on right now with Russia and Ukraine?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things, and this is something that I mentioned in my blog post, but one of the things that I really want to emphasize to people is that for so many people, I mean, particularly for people of Jewish background, but not only, family histories cross these borders. So my great grandmother was born in Warsaw. My grandfather, who I was just talking about, was actually born in Artyomovsk, which is currently the city of Bakhmut, which is very close to the separatist territories in the Donbass area.
Okay.
My father's parents and their whole family. Well, my father's parents were born in Kiev, and they grew up there and lived there until they finished university, with the exception of the war years. So, this is a very, in many ways, it's a very typical Ashkenazi Jewish, background, where our roots come from the area of the Pale of Jewish Settlement, which crosses contemporary borders, and this is actually, very typical story for many families in that part of the world, not just Jewish families. So my best friend was born in Kiev. Her family ethnically is, mixed, Ukrainian and Russian. They, were largely Russian speakers. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's so important to understand that. I mean, don't get me wrong. There's a very, I fully support Ukraine's right to sovereignty, of course, but the reality is that historically and culturally, the people who live here, who live in those areas, have close ties to one another. Families live in, some families, have relatives who live across the border, friends. There are many historical and cultural and family ties that cross borders. So and of course, one of those sort of shared experiences is the experience of the Second World War. So I think this is in part why, war is always awful, of course, but this is in part why it's so particularly painful that you see these countries, peoples fighting with one another, despite the fact that there's, there are a lot of, there are a lot of connections between people who live in Ukraine, people who live in Russia, and it is on some level almost, like setting brother against brother. So, for my paternal grandfather, he is 93. He was born in Kiev, loved Kiev, grew up in Kiev, actually lived in Kiev during the Second World War, and then moved to Moscow for graduate school and raised his family, his family there. But for him, this idea of Russia and Ukraine being at war with one another is just insane, and it's extremely painful because, he considers himself as part of both of those communities. So it's like, it's like the two cities where he lived most of his life are at war with one another, Moscow and Kiev.
I would guess he's probably not all that different from so many other people, particularly of that generation, pre Soviet Union breakup, but, people who would go from one big city to another, whether it's for school, for work, for family reasons, right? He's probably,
Absolutely.
Not all
Absolutely.
that unique.
Absolutely, it was extremely common, and people did this all the time, right? They as you said, they moved for school, they moved for work positions, and it was not a problem because it was all Soviet Union, so it wasn't like you were really. You were basically moving within your own country, but even, and as a result, even after 91, when these became separate republics, again, family members lived in what was now different countries, and that was fine, and they traveled to visit one another, and those connections, understandably persisted. And kind of the fact that, a few years ago, it became really difficult to travel, or flights were canceled between Moscow and Kiev, it felt, for a lot of people, it felt just really, insane and really kind of horrific, because these were seen as, Kiev was a very, common place to visit. It was, it's like Americans, I guess, sort of not being able to travel to Mexico, but with Mexico, we have somewhat different cultures and languages and all of that. Between Russia and Ukraine, there's more cultural and historical closeness.
fascinating. It's really, I mean, I can imagine for somebody of your grandfather's generation to sit and watch this, how hard this has to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's this sense, and I think we're hearing it from the news that we get. I mean, there's this deep sense of what there's no reason for this, right? And of course, war is horrible again whenever it happens. But I think when we talk about the Second World War, right, the mission was pretty clear, right? And Hitler presented a huge threat to the lives and the way of life of millions of people. So even though it was horrible, and my grandfather lost his father during the Second World War. So in that sense, the war was horrible, but there was a sense of mission and purpose. Like, this is why we're at war. This, seems to boil down to the desires and ambitions of a single man and his potentially his closest inner circle. And Russians and Ukrainians have no real reason to be fighting with each other. There's no, why are they don't have, why are these people dying for what?
I mean, it feels like it's just the ego of one guy who wants this to happen and has some dreams of reunification.
Right, absolutely, and exactly, and he has, I think, a vision of a particular vision of Russian greatness that in his mind, and kind of a recreated Russian empire that in his mind demands that Ukraine be, part of that, that Ukraine be subservient to Russia. But and again, one of the again, another heartbreaking part of the story is that that Putin is legitimizing this conflict, particularly to the domestic audience, by claiming that Ukrainians and the Ukrainian regime are Nazis, and claiming that the Russian mission is that of denazification. And from what I've heard, a significant number of people in Russia do believe that, because they don't have access to other forms of information, so this is what they're told, and that reasoning resonates a great deal with people there, because the war, the Second World War, was such an important watershed historical moment, and there's a lot of pride of Russia playing the key role in defeating the Soviet Union, playing the key role in defeating Hitler, and every family lost family members in the course of the war, which is referred to in Russia as the Great Patriotic War. So the sense of Russia's contribution to the victory in the Second World War and its sacrifices is a huge moment of pride and self-identity in Russia. So it's not surprising that Putin is using that explanation. That kind of explanation resonates with people, because that's such an important touchstone for people. It's in many ways kind of the last instance when Russia did something, was truly, truly great and kind of saved the world in many ways. So it's not surprising that rationale, that's the narrative that Putin has gone with. But Ukrainians fought alongside Russians in that conflict. They died alongside Russians in that conflict. The Ukraine was occupied by the Nazis in a very very difficult occupation. Kiev was bombed. Ukrainian Jews perished, and were massacred, as we know. And again, like people like my grandfather, his father, was in the army and perished during the war. So and of course, as we know, President Zelensky has Jewish background. Yeah. So and lost members of his family during the war. So this it's particularly, this narrative is so wrong, and it's particularly heartbreaking that people have somehow been convinced or brainwashed that that the Ukrainians who again fought along whose um, ancestors fought alongside them during the war are now somehow Nazis.
Yeah, that's it's got to be tough for those people who survived everything they did to now be told that they're Nazis, basically.
Yeah.
It's incredibly difficult for them. I think, and for everybody, I think it's difficult for everybody, but it certainly resonates more for people who have family that's from there or have a background in that part of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, my maternal grandmother, her family. I mean, she and her parents were in Moscow during the before the Second World War, but her father was from Kiev, not surprisingly, and his brothers and their families lived in Kiev. One of his brothers died in the early was an engineer who perished in the early days of the Second World War as he was working to defend or build Borispol, which is the major airport in Kiev. And he, before he perished, he sent a note to his brother, my great grandfather, asking him to save his family. And my great grandfather was able to get the wife and children out of Kiev. But again, like, talk about, everything, the interconnectedness is really within families is really common. This is just not it's not unusual by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, I mean, an incredibly harrowing time that your family went through many years ago and that many are going through once again, unfortunately. But can we take things on a complete 180 and end on a lighter note?
Sure.
So the way we usually end these, I know it seems a little weird after very heavy topics that we just covered, but I guess for starters, what is your favorite Jewish holiday?
My favorite Jewish holiday would have to be Passover.
Okay. How come?
I love I love the Seder tradition. I love the all the ritual foods and stories. And I think moreover, as a historian who studies displacement, I think it's so cool that we have this holiday in which we tell the main part of the holiday is to tell the story of something that happened to our people. Yeah. So I think it's so meaningful. I think so, I will 100% confess that I come from a Soviet Jewish background, a secular Soviet Jewish background. My parents grew up in the Soviet Union and definitely didn't attend synagogue. So I learned a lot about Jewish tradition when we immigrated to this country. And, my husband and I recently have become members of our temple here in Duluth, Temple Israel. But in the past I would attend synagogue kind of sporadically. But I think kind of I bristled at some, it can be frustrating to me when I'm like, I don't really understand what's going on here and why are we saying these things and what's the meaning of these prayers or of these rituals. And what I really love about Passover is that it's so, the story is so powerful and it's so clear. Like, we're doing this to remember this episode, and all of these rituals and all of these symbolic foods help us remember that historical moment of that story of our people, and to pass it down to the younger generation. So my husband and I are hoping to have a child, and I really look forward, like, telling my child about that and passing down that tradition.
Oh, absolutely. And Passover's coming up, so almost time for that.
Yep.
And what is your favorite Jewish food?
My favorite Jewish food, I really enjoy matzo ball soup.
Okay.
My great grandmother, who unfortunately has now been gone for over a decade. But my great grandmother, who I mentioned was born in Warsaw, was amazing at making gefilte fish. So I really loved her gefilte fish.
Is there anybody's matzo ball soup? Is there like a family recipe that you're the proud owner of now?
No. Unfortunately, matzo ball soup was not something that really, like, there were some recipes, like gefilte fish in particular, that we made back in the Soviet Union. Matzo ball soup was something that I was introduced to in this country, and I enjoy that.
Excellent. Well, Natalie Belsky, thank you so much for joining me this week, covering some heavy topics, to be sure. And we'll have a link to your article that we ran on TC Jewfolk earlier in March in the show notes. But thank you again so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
The Who the Folk podcast is part of the Jewfolk Podcast Network, a product of Jewfolk Inc. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you have suggestions for other podcast guests, please email them to me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. For our other shows, check out tcjewfolk.com/podcast.